3 years ago, it was the beginning of August, and I was 3 months into my brand new job when I left work. Walked through the empty parking structure with my taser tucked inside the sleeve of my jacket, my eyes darting toward every dark nook and cranny. It was somewhere around 1 a.m., and the parking lot was deserted, which made every hair on my body stand on end. My phone was in my pocket with my best friend on the line, listening for a scream. I clutched my keys in my other hand. The second I saw my car, I sped up, tugging on the door just as a habit before I went to unlock it. Before I could do that, however, the door opened in my hand. Unlocked. I cocked my head, sure I'd locked it. No, wait. I wasn't sure. I was positive. I knew for a fact I'd locked the doors, because I knew what happened to stupid little girls when they didn't lock the doors. Still, a part of me wondered if maybe, just maybe this once, I'd forgotten. I got in the car, shut the door behind me, hit the lock button, told my best friend I was safe in my car. Hung up, lather, rinse, repeat. It was only after I'd started to put my key in the ignition that I froze. I'm a pretty short girl, so it only took a moment to realize that the seat was pushed back much farther than I ever would have pushed it. I looked around, my eyes sweeping the interior. Although there wasn't anything jarringly obvious, something was off. Brushing past my unease, I turned the key in the ignition. All around me are familiar faces. I jumped, my hand flying to my mouth as music blasted from my stereo. The wipers scraped across my windshield. All my dashboard settings had been changed. The time set 4 hours and 14 minutes into the future. All my radio stations, except for the 4th station that I was currently listening to, had been changed to static. He's here. I spun around, half expecting to see a darkly dressed figure sitting in the back seat. No one was there, of course, but the blanket I'd had strung across the seat was now perfectly folded, and on top of that rested a tiny silver box. Inside, there was the edge of a torn parking pass for the hotel I worked at. That's all. Just enough for me to know what it was, what it meant, but not enough for me to know who it belonged to. I checked the rest of my car, searched for any sign of tampering. At some point I realized that my car hadn't been broken into. The doors had been unlocked, and they'd been able to turn my car on, but they hadn't hot-wired the car. I could see that clearly. I called my dad. "I need you to check and see if you still have my spare key," I said instead of hello. Still half asleep, my dad grumbled. "It's outside in the truck." My blood ran cold. My dad's truck that had been sitting outside all day. My dad's truck that he wouldn't have noticed someone breaking into because it was 20 years old and didn't have an alarm, like my new car. "Please," I whispered, too scared to raise my voice. For once, he didn't argue. He went outside, he checked his car, and he told me what I already knew. My key wasn't there. In its place, however, he'd found a little bouncy ball, like the one you'd get from a quarter machine at the grocery store. "He was in your car?" My dad sounded horrified, but not surprised. We were never surprised anymore. "Wait," my dad paused. "What about your spare house key? Is it still there?" No. I held my breath as I rummaged through my glove compartment. I nearly tore the whole thing apart, silent tears running down my face as I searched for something I knew was long gone. "We'll change the locks," my dad promised. What he didn't say was again. I cried the whole time I drove home. My dad waited on the front porch for me, a gun tucked in the waistband of his pants. Inside, I barricaded myself in my room. I pushed my dresser in front of the door, took a blanket and sat in the corner of the room with one of my dad's guns on the floor next to me and a knife in my hand. I stayed there until the sun came up, and I stayed there until my eyes were too dry to cry any more tears. I stayed there so long I wasn't even 100% sure I was awake anymore. I stared at the single bouncy ball on the floor in front of me, nudging it back and forth with the tip of my knife. Pink. My favorite color. I'm 41 years old and currently working as a salesman at a retail outlet that specializes in men's business suits. The job makes pretty good money, but with alimony to my ex-wife and child support on top of that, I seem to just barely get by. I had just finished going through the horror of divorce 6 months before this last incident occurred. I had started drinking again, drinking and looking longingly at sleeping pill bottles and razor blades. I know what you're thinking, but I've always been too much of a coward for that sort of thing. Though I will admit it's always seemed tempting, especially after losing everything like I did. Anyway, as you can imagine, I was feeling pretty low for a few weeks, so I was quite pleasantly surprised when this elegant, beautiful woman about my age came into the store and began to show me some interest. She was tall and slim, wearing a charcoal jacket and skirt combo, her hair discreetly dyed a bronze amber, and she had a very unassuming smile, not too blemished by laugh lines or crow's feet. I admit I'd noticed her before she approached me. I spotted her the moment she entered through the door. She seemed kind of familiar, but I wasn't going to tell her that. That's got to be the most obvious non-pickup line in the world, telling a strange woman she looks familiar. Anyway, she walked up to me with this coy smile, just showing a glimpse of perfect white teeth, and said, "You probably think I'm in the wrong store." I gave a little giggle, cleared my throat, and said, "I'm sorry." "This is a men's clothing store, obviously," she elaborated. Her eyes were deep brown, almost black, and they were lively and active, looking up at me. "Well, ma'am," I said, "we do have some pantsuits and some jackets for ladies if you'd like me to show you." "Ma'am," she remarked playfully, "do I really look that old to you?" I chuckled nervously, breaking eye contact with her and clearing my throat again. God, I must have seemed like a schoolboy. I then told her not at all, that she didn't look old, but that I just wanted to be respectful. Her smile widened, her long purple fingernails fidgeting with her purse strap. "Well," she said in a soft, heavy voice, "I'm actually here to find a suit for my son. He wants a tuxedo for prom." I furrowed my brow. This was the dead of winter. Proms aren't usually held until June or late May at the earliest. "I know," she said, reading my look. "His school is impossible. They want to hold it early so that the students don't get too distracted from their studies. My son's also too busy playing computer games to go get a suit himself, and too embarrassed to come with me, so here I am." I couldn't help but grin eagerly. Just my luck, I thought. I showed her some of our more popular items. She told me her son's size and measurements, and together we found something she thought he'd like. The whole time she sided close to me, and I could smell her floral perfume. It was soothing, and I'll admit, I didn't make any attempt to distance myself from her. As I was ringing her up at the cash till, I told her that if anything didn't quite fit, she could bring it back in and we'd happily have it adjusted to fit her son. She gave a low, almost inaudible laugh, and told me that I probably didn't have to worry about that. There were no other customers in the store then, and the other cashier was on break, so we continued to chat. She asked me what I did in my spare time for fun, and I hesitated, thinking of the rows of empty liquor bottles in my apartment and the sleeping pills next to the bathtub. Instead of answering her question, I jumped at the opportunity and asked her if she'd like to get a drink later that evening. She said nothing but tilted her head and scanned me with her sexy, roaming eyes. "When do you get off work?" she muttered softly. "At 7, the words leapt from my mouth. "If that's not too late for you." "No," she said, her pearly grin flashing at me over supple red lips. "That's perfect. I know a bar around this area. I'll be out front to pick you up." "Great," I said. "What's your name again?" "Andrea." "Andrea," I repeated, extending my hand. "I'm Andy. Nice to meet you." "Naturally." That seemed to put my nagging feeling of déjà vu to rest. I had never known an Andrea, or met any Andreas for that matter. But the name was fitting, and I rolled each syllable over and over across my tongue, waiting for the hours of my shift to wilt away. By 6:30 we were locking up. Jane, the girl working there, was balancing the cash register while I wrote the day's records in the books. As I wrote down the total debits and credits, I could barely hold on to the pencil. I was so jittery. I know how pathetic this must sound, but it had been a while since I had been with a woman in any way. Being older and just divorced, it was hard to build up the confidence to start dating again. By 7 o'clock, it was dark out. Jane walked out and waved goodbye as I locked up the front door. At the curb in front of the sidewalk was a small blue station wagon, not very fancy, but I wasn't about to complain. I looked through the passenger side window and saw Andrea peering out at me, her hooded eyes meeting mine, that slight smile drawn across her face. As she navigated out of the plaza and onto the road, I prattled on about the tuxedo I had sold her and how most customers said they were really happy with it. She didn't respond and wasn't smiling anymore. I didn't think too deep into it, though. The only thing that struck me as odd was that she had placed her purse on her lap while she was driving. Since I had had to sell my car after the divorce, I was very pleased to not have to ride the bus, so I just eased back in my seat and enjoyed. I think that's the reason that I didn't notice that we had been on the road a long time despite her telling me this bar was close by. I knew something was up after she had gotten onto a highway interchange. I looked at her very confused. "Did you say this bar was out of town?" I asked. She didn't respond. Her eyes were glued to the road as we cruised up the ramp and onto the interstate. By now I was really getting nervous. I noticed she took her left hand from the steering wheel and began reaching inside her purse. "You really don't remember me?" she said, her voice just louder than the car engine. I giggled a bit, but I didn't find this funny at all. I don't know," I stammered, looking at her. "You do look familiar, but I know I've never met an Andrea before." I looked down at her lap, into her now opened purse, and felt my heart freeze in my chest. Inside, the taped handle held in her delicate fingers was a snub-nosed revolver. I squirmed in my seat, as if I was going to fly out from the window, the seatbelt digging into my neck. What the hell are you doing?" I shouted between panted breaths. The gun was now out and pointed at me. "You probably don't know any Andrea," she said coldly, her voice empty, vacant. "But you might remember Alicia Moretto." Probably from the panic I felt staring down the barrel of that gun, the name didn't ring any bells. She then looked at me, those bedroom eyes now burning like hot coals. "Open the glove box," she muttered in a staid voice. I shuddered from the sharp change in her voice. I did as I was told. Gingerly, I stretched my shaking hand and pushed the lock button. The compartment door fell open, and out spilled what had to be hundreds of pages of paper. They were all lying at my feet. She peered down in a quick glance and instructed me to read the stapled pages printed on red paper. I picked them up and immediately recognized what it was: my post of my Stalker story to an internet forum for true horror stories. I then figured out who she was: Alicia Moretto, the mentally disturbed girl who had stalked me at my workplace and at my home years ago, when I was in my late teens. I pleaded with her and she just hollered at me to read it, her eyes back on the road, but the revolver still trained on me. I did as she said. It was all there, my words: how she had come into the coffee shop where I worked, how her hair was constantly tangled and greasy, how her clothes were always in tatters, how she always smelled of Vaseline. It was all there: how she had come in every morning, how she knew my schedule and when my shift started, how my co-workers had told me that she would sometimes come in on my days off and ask where I was, how one night I had found her waiting for me in my house. I tried to swallow, but I couldn't. I was trembling and the printed-out pages fell from my weak hands involuntarily. She peered over at me. I could see her from the corner of my eyes, and told me to pick up the next set of pages, the one printed on gray paper. I begged her again to just let me go, and she screamed for me to read it. I picked them up, not recognizing any of the writing on it. Then I realized that these were comments people had written on my post of the story. Comments like, "What a crazy bitch," or "I would have been so freaked by that cow." Tears had started streaming down my face by the time I'd realized what this was. She had found my story, recognized it, and had come for me. "Please," I said to her, choked up having read all the comments and realized her purpose. "I didn't know it would upset you this much. I never used your real name." "Do you think that matters?" Her voice cracked. It was like an animal growling at me, all the prior sophistication and sensuality gone. I was now staring out the window. I could just make out open fields in the distance with the slightest smattering of brush. Where the hell was she taking me? I gulped and asked, "How did you find me?" She smiled maliciously in my direction, amused by my discomfort. "It didn't take long. I knew your full name, where you had once worked, and where you grew up. I was, of course, surprised you still lived there after all these years." Her smile was now spiteful and mocking. That and her last comment made me look away, slightly galled. The road we had driven on had disintegrated into a rough path of scrappy concrete. It was as though we had gone back in time to when there was nothing but dirt and jungle. I actually started worrying that if we drove any longer that road would stop, or we'd be stranded in desert. Regardless, she drove on, the car swaying and lurching over the craggy pavement. I looked at the clock on the dash and the green numbers revealed 12:03. We had been driving for hours. Another hour passed with nothing, just silence. I started absorbing what she'd told me and felt this weight form in the pit of my stomach. By 1 o'clock she slowed down. We pulled over, parking on a gravel shoulder by a vast empty field. When she killed the engine, her headlights died, and it went all black beyond the windshield. My eyes adjusted, and I could just make out the black shape of the field beneath the lighter shade of the starless night sky. We both sat there, not looking at each other. She didn't move, didn't stir, the revolver still trained on me. "I'm sorry," I said. My voice was damp and contrite. She didn't look at me, didn't move, but I knew she heard me. "Go ahead," I then said to her. "Kill me. I deserve to be hurt. I deserve to die. I don't want to live anymore anyway." Just then she straightened in her seat, still staring out into the field before us. "No," she said huskily. "You deserve to feel what I feel every day." I then heard the hammer click backward and watched as she opened her perfect mouth and stuck the barrel inside. I shouted and lunged toward her, but bang! There was a flash and I saw spots. My ears were ringing and blocked like I was underwater. After about a minute, my eyes adjusted. The interior was splattered with her blood. My hand groped endlessly for the door handle, finally finding it, and I fell out onto the pebbled ground from the passenger side. I got on my hands and knees and puked my guts out. After I stood up, I doubled over and dry heaved for several minutes. I had been terrified, not knowing what she had planned for me. I could never have imagined how my evening would finally end. On a hot July evening almost 30 years ago, my then boyfriend, now husband, Mark, and I were in his second-floor apartment kitchen, chatting and laughing. He worked as a clinical psychologist at a Boston psychiatric hospital. What should have been a sweet Sunday night, Red Sox game on the radio, me cooking pasta, would become the start of our horror story. The next morning, Mark, fresh from a therapy session, called me, his voice trembling. "One of my clients was spying on us last night. She was listening to our conversation from under the window." When Mark told me that she asked about taking him to a Red Sox game and wanted to know what I'd been cooking for dinner, I was concerned but not panicked. Whatever this was, I figured Mark could handle it. Didn't the occasional client develop a crush on my handsome boyfriend with a warm voice and quick wit? I assumed that with a few more sessions this would be solved. As a writer, I was even intrigued and imagined the premise of a novel. A woman goes into a therapist's office and knows things about him that she shouldn't. A few days later, I teased Mark about his stalker, but he didn't crack a smile. I took stock of his seriousness as he explained that he was getting a professional consultation and had switched her to another therapist. Apparently, Mark had already been dealing with her burgeoning crush for months, but had not foreseen this full-blown obsession. Then she started filling his work voicemail with professions of love, declaring her need to be with him or not live. Not live, I repeated. Would she actually do something that drastic? Mark shook his head. He didn't know what she was capable of, and for my safety advised me to watch out for a woman in her late 40s, short, thin, with straight brown hair to her shoulders. She was divorcing her husband and claimed to have nothing to live for. What she did have was money and time on her hands to pursue her 17-year younger obsession, my boyfriend. It sounded creepy, but it didn't fully hit home until that Saturday. Mark and I returned from an afternoon shopping trip to find 16 messages on our answering machine. We listened as a high, pleading voice echoed in the foyer. Mark, this is Susan. I love you. I'm sorry, Sandra, but I would be lying if I pretended this wasn't true. We exchanged a questioning look. How had she gotten Mark's unlisted number? This was 1995, before you could find everything online. It would be a while before we realized she had stolen a phone bill from his mailbox. We continued to listen as 15 more messages played through, each building with intensity until they reached a crescendo of sobs and pleas that went into another realm of fixation, far beyond the benign client with a crush I'd been imagining. I finally realized this was not something that could be managed with reassurance and talk therapy. We were dealing with a serious situation and someone who needed attention from a mental health professional. Note, some names and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. Mark warned me against ever speaking to her when she called. Beyond that, for reasons having to do with professional confidentiality, he almost never spoke about her, which means I didn't know that she was threatening to have her brothers beat Mark up if he didn't go back to working with her. I also didn't know the extent of the pornographic messages she was leaving for him at work until she started leaving them on our home machine too. Mark didn't change his phone number because he was about to move in with me. So I changed my number to an unlisted one, and we naively thought a new residence was going to keep her away. If only. It's likely that she followed him to our first-floor apartment and then found her way into that mailbox, this time stealing my phone bill. About 50 calls came each day when we were at work. When we were home, the phone rang nonstop. If I answered, Susan hung up. We changed our number again and asked AT&T to leave our number off the bill, but an employee told us the company could not issue bills without a phone number printed on them. We had our landlord cut a mail slot in our door and for a few days thought we'd beaten her system. Then neighbors started to report a woman regularly climbing over their fences and bolting across their yards. I was furious and scared. Susan loved Mark too much to hurt him, but I didn't know how she felt about hurting me. It seemed she did want to hurt herself if she couldn't have Mark. We obviously didn't want that, and we also knew that if she self-harmed, her family could register complaints with the licensing board and file a lawsuit against any of her therapists, including Mark. There was a side of me that felt sorry for her. I knew she would never be this abusive if she weren't suffering from her own mental health issues. Her instinct to invade our lives in the name of love came from her own pain. But she was so horribly invasive that it was hard to keep my anger in check. Almost as bad as Susan's intrusiveness was how she infected our once happy relationship. The stress of being stalked led us to argue more and enjoy each other less. We stopped relaxing on our back porch. We kept our windows shut. Even worse than feeling imprisoned in our home was how she was hurting us as a couple. Mark explored every legal measure to keep her away, but the law doesn't always support the innocent. Criminal restraining orders are limited to significant others, relatives, and people you've lived with. Civil restraining orders require that you pay a large sum of money and make at least 3 court appearances with the very person you're trying to avoid. That was what Susan wanted, to see Mark however she could. Instead of a restraining order, we had our local police on speed dial, hoping they'd catch her trespassing. Mark also got friendly with the security force at his hospital, where Susan, despite having been banished from the grounds, was chronically sneaking into his office building. Even when she wasn't around, she was around. I was alone in bed one summer night when the door creaked open. I started shrieking and beating at the darkness with a pillow, shouting, "Get the hell out of our house!" It was the breeze that had blown the door open. Susan sent effusive bouquets of flowers that we weren't allowed to accept. Once she mailed us 2 concert tickets for Sean Colvin, one of my favorite performers. "I want to go," I said tentatively to Mark, feeling entitled to some compensation for all I'd put up with. Mark looked at me apologetically and tucked the tickets in the file we'd been keeping for the police. "Who do you think is in the seat next to ours?" he asked. Next, Susan enrolled us in the Harry and David Fruit of the Month Club, but Mark said we had to call the company and cancel the subscription, which I did. When 4 individually packaged Asian pears arrived anyway the following month, Mark, delirious with stress, accused me of not canceling it and using his stalker to my fruit-loving advantage. "For fucking pears," I said sarcastically. "Those were definitely worth every minute that woman has spent trying to ruin our lives." We managed to get engaged in the middle of this ordeal, a testimony to the strength of our love in the face of incessant harassment. We proposed to each other on a trip to Canada and couldn't wait to get home and share our news. When we arrived at our door, we found one of the front porch windows had been broken and the glass pieces were taped back together. I started to shake. She'd been in our house. With that, we were done and hired a lawyer. Susan was warned that if she ever came near our home again, we were pressing criminal charges. She responded by saying she would die by suicide on our porch. True to her word, she showed up at our door a few nights later and rang the bell. Trembling, I peered out the peephole for my first clear view of the woman who had spent years trying to ruin our lives. She looked pathetic, worthy of pity, but all I could think was, "I despise you." I called the police, but Susan threw herself in her car just as they arrived. She led them on a high-speed chase that culminated on a dead-end street. The police found her purse full of pills, a love note to Mark, and a knife. They also found Mark's scuba diving license with his photo in her wallet. He'd always wondered why it had never arrived in the mail after the diving company assured him they had sent it. After months spent categorizing answering machine tapes, love letters, therapy notes, and other extraneous evidence, the case went to trial. The most memorable moment for me was when the district attorney looked Mark in the eye and said, "I hope you never in your life have to deal with this woman again." With Susan receiving a sentence of 2 years, most of which were spent in a psychiatric hospital, followed by 2 years of ankle-monitored parole, we had a beautiful wedding and honeymoon year. During that time, our son was born, and we moved into our own home. Then it happened. A call, a hang-up, a harassing message. Parole was over and Susan was back. This time she was claiming Mark had had sex with her when he was her therapist and she was going to sue him for malpractice. Her obsession had flipped to hatred and vengeance. The calls went on for weeks, during which I was often numb with fear and too busy and tired to face this again. Then one day Mark was out with our son and he saw Susan's car tailing him. He drove directly to the police station where an officer chased her and wrote her up for stalking. In court that Monday, she appeared before the same judge who had sentenced her the first time. "I don't like people coming back for the same offense twice," he said. Susan received 5 more years of probation. Even with Susan gone again, the effects lingered. A ringing phone, the doorbell, a knock on the door in the middle of the day. Any reminder could cause me to go into fight or flight mode, but I didn't want to give that woman any more of my energy, time, or joy. She had taken enough from our family,